Hello, everyone, and a huge thank you for joining us today for our discussion on fostering a culture of experimentation in your engineering teams. This is a Lead Dev webinar created in partnership with Split. And our webinar today will last about 45 minutes. After that, both myself as well as our esteemed panelists will head over to the Lead Dev Slack channel to answer your questions. We'll be in the hashtag building software channel. Now, we do have time carved out to answer a couple of questions live, so please use the Q&A feature on Zoom and we'll get to them. However, if things run over and we're really having a juicy and spicy and engaging discussion, we might have to push questions to the building software channel in Slack. So with that, let's get started. I'm Aralee McSweeney, and today I'll be joined by Ariel Perez, VP of Engineering at Split, Lisi Hawke, Quality Engineer at Ada Health, and Jason van der Merwe, Director of Engineering at Strava. Together, we'll be sharing experiences and insights on fostering a culture of experimentation. So I'll ask each panelist to introduce themselves formally. Lisi, let's start with you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lisi. My pronouns are she and her. And I've been working in testing and quality-related roles for over 14 years now, usually embedded in cross-functional product teams. And that's also where I thrive and what I love doing, like building great products together with great people. And I'm really excited to be on this panel today here because I just love experimentation, especially as it helped us move forward in those teams heavily when it comes to building quality products. So yeah, looking forward to this.
Awesome. Thank you. Jason.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jason. I'm a director of engineering at Strava. I joined Strava over 8 years ago, and I got to help start the growth team, which at the time was 5 people. And since then have worked with a lot of others to grow the growth team from one little team to an org of over 70 people. And at Strava, I'm also responsible for our feed and search team. So experimentation is everything is in everything I do. I've gotten to build our experimentation culture and platform out at Strava, and talking about how we can empower engineers to embrace experimentation and have larger impacts on their teams and organizations is something I feel very strongly about. And I'm really excited to talk with these two here about some of our experiences, and hopefully you can learn something and take something to your own org and further the experimentation culture in other companies.
That's awesome. Ariel?
Hi, everyone. My name is Ariel Perez. I am the VP of Engineering for Measurement and Learning at Split. I've spent my entire career, about 20 years or so, working on engineering teams, product and engineering teams. I moved back and forth between roles. I've combined the roles, melded them, bounced around from enterprises to small startups to running my own startup to consulting. So I've seen engineering and development from every single angle, and it's brought me all kinds of experiences. I've firmly believed in the power of experimentation and the ability and the need to test every idea with customers, because you don't really know if it's going to work until you put it out there. And that's driven many of the decisions I've made and decisions I've helped drive in my teams when it came to, should we build this? Should we ship this? How quickly can we put it out there to test it? And it's brought me full circle into Split, where this is the product we sell to our customers. So I have gotten lots of insights, thankfully, of working with many, many customers, many engineering teams, product teams, and working through that with them and through their own struggles on understanding how do you build a culture of experimentation in your engineering teams. So I'm very excited to talk about that today with these other two amazing panelists.
We can tell. I love the energy. And now for a little bit about me. I'm Aralee McSweeney. I'm an engineering director at Etsy. I lead our front-end focused teams. I've been working at Etsy for 10 years, so I've had the experience of being an individual contributor, and now I lead platform-focused teams. And this topic is particularly exciting to me because experimentation for platform teams looks a little bit different, and many might conclude that the stakes are somewhat higher. Nevertheless, I find that it's important to foster a culture of curiosity, innovation, and of course, experimentation. So I'm so happy you're here. Let's dig in. Overall, the notion of fostering a culture of experimentation always sparks a lot of discussion and a lot of debate. And it shouldn't be a surprise. Many businesses want to minimize risk and maximize business impact. However, when it comes to experimentation, there's a lot of reward to be had, but it also comes with the likelihood or the potential for risk. And that's what makes even the best leaders uncomfortable. So why don't we start with Jason? Can you share your perspective? How can companies balance the need for experimentation with the need for growth, stability, and reliability?
Yeah, that's a great question and a fairly common question that I get both internally at Strava and externally. And I actually think it's a false dichotomy to think of experimentation as something at odds with stability and reliability. Experimentation is really a learning and measurement framework or a way of thinking. It's not a synonym for move fast and break things. Experimentation really starts with identifying a problem, either user, business, technical problem, and then ideating on a few solutions. But the crux of experimentation is trying out one or more solutions with a framework of determining which solution is best. So this can apply to a user problem, like which UI layout is most appealing to a user. But it can also apply to a technical problem, like, hey, if I change the SQL query, does the API get faster? But the most important piece of experimentation is reflecting on what worked, and you figure that out through measurement. So let's say in my previous example, someone on your team said, hey, I improved the performance of this API by optimizing a SQL query. You would say, well, that's great, but how much did you improve it? And so the engineer would probably simply look at a graph and say, report the before and after of the performance, which is awesome. But in more complex situations, we start using an A/B testing framework to determine that answer. But the core of experimentation is identical in both situations and actually really simple. Make some changes and then measure the result. So experimentation, I think at least, is no different to making any other changes you might in your tech stack or product. There's always risk, right? When you change a line of code, always risk. So ideally, you're using safety net systems like feature flags, monitoring, alerting to account for changes that you're shipping. And actually at Strava, we use experimentation to help identify ways to improve reliability and performance and stability, and then measure those changes. So for instance, we know how many more users we can retain by improving our main feed API performance by 1 second. So in that case, we're using experimentation to actually improve performance, reliability, and stability. And it's not an either or. It's really, you can have your cake and eat it, which is really exciting.
That is exciting. I'd like to take one more panelist, though. Ariel, how about you?
I think Jason covered it pretty much, broadly, and covered every bit that I was going to say, even thinking, false dichotomy, because exactly what I was going to say. But I am going to zoom in on a specific set of words you used, which actually is in my title, that we learn and measure, right? So that's the name of our group, measurement and learning, and not experimentation, because that's the key thing that you're doing as you're rolling out capabilities and using experimentation to guide you. You don't know the impact of anything you're going to ship. You can assume, you have a guess, you have an assumption. And the idea of using experimentation to reduce risk, to increase growth, to improve stability and improve reliability is that you're not certain how something's going to work. So if you think ahead of time on what are your various hypotheses as to how this change might impact the metrics that matter to you, be that error rates, be that load times, be that any kind of performance measurement, or even product metrics, then you can approach this development with curiosity. You go ship it and you start monitoring and measuring and understanding, did this have the intended effect that I was looking for? Did it improve performance? That's awesome. Or on the other side, the same approach applies for mitigating risk through alerting early and measuring for negative impact, applying experimental ideas. And the idea of experimenting, particularly with A/B tests, can also help reduce risk on the flip side, where you find an unintended impact. I think in that same example that Jason was talking about, we might roll out something we said a 1 second improvement in performance increases conversion rates for your customers. You might also find that comes at the cost of some other metric on stability. And applying applying this as methodology, you can find that, hey, I did improve performance by 1%, and that's great because it improved my top line and my product metrics. But somehow the stability of the system, somehow maybe my error rates also shot up through the roof in this other part of the system. And thinking of experimentation will not only help you find that early, but also more directly attribute that change to that particular impact. You'll be able to say, it wasn't noise in the system, it wasn't something else in some other part. My monitoring stack might not notice it, but running this as an experiment will say that this particular error rate and the increase in errors was due specifically to this feature. So let me shut it off so we can go back and figure out what to fix.
Exactly. That makes sense. And I think that that really ties what both you and Jason said in terms of having tooling in place, having measurement in place, and tying all of that to a certain hypothesis that you're validating. So thank you both for that. I do think that when it comes to experimentation, it's probably important that we take some time to define it. So Ariel, I'm going to come back to you. How do you define experimentation, and what are some successful examples of experimentation you've seen in engineering teams? What have you learned from them?
Awesome. Yes. So this is why I generally, especially when it comes to engineering teams, I think there is this almost aversion, or not as much an aversion, but a fear to the word experimentation. Engineering teams feel, I don't experiment. But then when you ask them, well, are you sure this change is going to have the intended impact? No. Well, how are you going to measure they're going to have the impact? I have these particular metrics that I'm going to be looking at. And then what are you going to do when it either confirms that it's working or you find that it's not working? Well, I either roll it back or roll it forward. So you really are experimenting under the hood. You just don't realize there's something about that word experimenting that seems to be linked to conversion rate optimization. Maybe it's something that only marketers do. And that's the key thing that I've realized with teams. So I define experimentation as the idea that we don't know what's going to happen. And we start with that assumption. We have a guess at what's going to happen, and then we develop understanding that guess. We develop with that guess in mind, and then we develop and deliver thinking about the mitigations that we're going to need in place in case things go wrong. And how quickly am I going to make that decision? What data am I going to look at to tell me whether we go back or go forward? So that's how I define experimentation. It's testing small things, testing changes, because we don't know how they're going to work. That's what I look at. And then what is one example how I've seen this work? We can talk about the big examples of Amazon, for example, at some point early on proved that every second, it was at Amazon, I believe, but every second of load time has I think a 7% impact on their conversion rates for e-commerce. It's something like that number, right? But that was an engineering team testing an idea, testing load times. They've done the inverse of every second of slowdown also impacts negatively. And that proved to the team that, hey, maybe we should look a little more at performance. You have all these product metrics, you have all these features, all these layouts, but every second I improve, I will impact the top line. And that connection is spectacular for an engineering team, and they often lose them. My engineering work, my engineering focused work that doesn't really look like product work actually impacts the product, actually impacts customers. Once you have that connection, that is like lighting, fuel under a fire for engineering teams to experiment more.
That's amazing. And yes, pretty impressive. I think we've all read that article from Amazon, and it's definitely something top of mind for us when we think about experimentation. How about Lisi? Can you share your definition of experimentation, and what are some successful examples you've seen?
Absolutely. So I'm thinking of experimentation not really in a scientific way in our everyday work situations. So it's okay not to have a control group and more formalized things that are very important when we talk about that context. But in our everyday work context, building another product, I really think of it as trying things out, doing things we haven't done in this way before and see how it goes. And that comes when we build products, like maybe changing features or adding more instrumentation. But it also applies to how we work, processes, anything that we do every day that will have an influence on what comes out of it at the end. That can be the product outcome, but that can be also the culture that we foster in the team in general, which, as I've been working in testing and quality, I've seen over and over is one of the decisive factors for what can come out of it in the end, also product-wise. So I think of experimentation really as, let's try different approaches, have ways to see, did we move into a better direction? Does it help us? Shall we continue? Or maybe it just didn't validate our assumptions, our hypotheses that we have, and shall we try something else? But not standing still, always trying to look for better. And it can be super tiny, just better every day. It could also be bigger. Now, an example that I had in my current team, actually. So when I joined that team, it was like nearly 2 years ago. It's a completely remote team, still cross-functional. When I joined here, I sort of faced a bit of a culture clash. I came from a very collaborative, also remotely working team, working very synchronously. A lot of pairing, ensemble sessions, everybody working on the same thing together, same moment, same time, remotely. And suddenly I was faced with a team who seemed to have never worked in that manner before, very siloed, very asynchronous, and very, very different. And I really felt the impact on what the outcome was, on the product outcome. So I really started a very simple thing, like an experiment with my own even, to see like, okay, let's try something. Because I realized, so my hypothesis was people just never made a good experience in collaborating together with another person in the same moment, like pairing. So because whenever I spoke about pairing or these kind of situations, there was not really a response. And I wonder why that is. So my assumption was maybe they just never experienced it. So let's just, stop talking about this all the time, and let's rather give them the experience and let's see what comes out of it. It might very well be that this is not the team for it, and it's not a working thing, but maybe everybody experiences it positively, and we can build on the benefits that come with that I've already known from previous teams. So what I try is stop talking and instead lure them into situations where we just naturally end up pairing, like right after our daily stand-up in the morning, like, hey, can you stay for a bit? I have a question on this. Start sharing my screen, start asking my questions, start interacting, collaborating as we go without even talking about that thing that I had in mind. And very soon I noticed, people realize, hey, that's beneficial. I get really fast feedback. Hey, we came up with questions nobody of us thought of before that really helped improve what we're building. So people pulled for more and more. And I realized, hey, that was working really, really well. And it really was influential on the culture. And that was a super little thing, just a little, not even super formalized, very small, that I also didn't even have to share with anybody. So everybody could be in a position to try these little things, see how it goes. But of course, you could also think bigger. In the team space, from retros, you can have action items taken with you in the form of experiments. Let's try this out for 2 weeks. It's not a big investment. Let's just see if it helps us. But you could also, again, have this bigger and trying to run this on an organization level as experiments to solve bigger problems. For example, maturity of teams when it comes to testing quality. Here was also a big experiment that I ran that consisted of a lot of little experiments in between to help teams foster that culture of continuous learning and how they could do that and how could they tackle their problems in different ways, and always measure, did we actually move closer to what we're achieving, what we want to achieve or not? So lots of different ways to get there.
Totally. And I really value that you brought in the non-technical side of experimentation. There's always new processes to become more efficient or to ensure that the team is working more cohesively. And so I really felt that was a strong value add to this conversation. I'd like to move us along now. I know we've been very excited to talk through all of this from the perspective of the engineers on the teams that we lead and support. So I'll start with you, Jason. How can engineers feel more empowered to experiment and innovate without that fear of failure?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the first thing I kind of think of when I hear that question is rethinking the idea of failure and orienting towards learning, and really creating a culture where you are trying to maximize learnings. You can kind of think of like there might be 5 wrong ways to develop a product, or 5 wrong ideas, but there's one like gold idea. And you might have to get rid of go through those 5 wrong ideas to get to that gold idea. And the faster you can figure out which things don't work, the faster you'll figure out what does work. And I think it's like kind of creating that culture to do that. And I think the one way we have done that at Strava is 2 ways two things I'll talk about. One is Experiments Day. So it's a thing we do where we take up basically a half day or a full day, and we tell the team, all the engineers, you can ship any experiment that you would like to ship as long as it contributes to the goals of the team. So let's say one of our teams is trying to increase follows created by new users. That's the goal, or maybe upload is the goal, obviously, for Strava. What are your ideas? What's going to improve that? And there's no approval process for them to go through. There's some like checks and balances, like, you can't remove a paywall or hurt subscription revenue. But for the most part, it's, hey, go try it out. And that empowers them to think through the kind of the problem, the objective, and try something. And underneath that, we have this meeting called Experiments Weekly, which happens right now bi-weekly. And it's where we go over all of the experiments that we've been running as a full group, and we discuss like what worked, what didn't work, what are we going to learn. And it's everyone's favorite meeting. And we've done this since we started the growth team 8 years ago. And now it's kind of funny because we have 70 people across 6 different growth teams. And so every team does their own small experiments weekly, and then we do one like bigger one. But it's where everyone is discussing like, what did we learn? Why did it happen this way? Why didn't it happen this way? And we really encourage trying to ship enough experiments where a lot of them are quote failing or not working. Because if you're not producing attempts that don't succeed, you're not being ambitious enough, right? You're sitting right below the basket, just shooting layups. You're not going for 3-pointers. And so we encourage like wanting to take risks. And by doing that, you kind of really normalize this idea of learning versus fear of failure. I think that really helps.
One thing I wanted to maybe interject here with, like, you talk about reframing, and I think it's really important to highlight this, but you talk about reframing failure to learning. Is that a change you had to navigate in your professional career? What were some of the things that helped to reframe that? Typically, mindsets are pretty robust and sometimes unmoving. So I'm very curious to lean into that. I suppose many of the people here today are interested in that little nuance.
Yeah. I think, it takes time to change mindsets. And so you can't, you're not going to build Rome overnight. So you have to take a long-term view. And I think it's about finding advocates in different parts of your teams that want to think like that. I think if you're starting to build your growth team or building a team that should have a lot of experimentation, find engineers that could be product managers or have said that. They're like, hey, I might want to actually switch out of engineering and go work on it as a product manager. You're like, yes. Like I always look for engineers that think like product managers. I'm like, yeah, thinking like, user problem, solution, ship, learn, and find those folks and empower them to go run with things. And I think, again, it also comes down to your relationship with your product manager. If they're very controlling or like they're the ones that make decisions, then you can't do a whole lot. But if you have a product manager that thinks about their job as setting context for the team, setting the business and the user problem context, now go and find solutions, you can start to kind of encourage engineers to start thinking like that and be like, whoa, this is really fun. Like I can both ideate and then build something. And I think once you start to show that pattern with 1 or 2 people that have that initiative, it kind of everyone gets really excited, because who doesn't love to kind of ideate? I think all of us, engineers became engineers because we realized we could build what we were thinking of, that we didn't have to rely on anyone else. And that is so empowering. And that's like the magic of being an engineer. And I think what's great about this is it doesn't take super senior engineers. Some of the best experimenters at Strava are kind of fresh out of college at their first job, because they have limitless ideas and they have there's no that built up, like you kind of mentioned, that built up ways of working where, hey, your job is to write code and ship things we tell you to. And so they just have all this creativity and brainstorming, and they just want to ship cool products. And so I think it's finding that and then kind of nurturing that over time. And then, you start to create a culture where everyone is kind of working and facilitating. And so, we will hire engineers who haven't worked in that kind of environment, and then they kind of see, oh, this is how I could do things. And that's really helpful. One other thing is we have a channel called Rolled Back at Strava, where people talk about the things that didn't work and they celebrate that. So we're celebrating the things we learned. And so it's just a really fun channel for people to be like, hey, I just tried this idea. I thought it was a slam dunk, didn't work.
Right.
And I think that really helps too.
It happens. It totally does. Ariel, I'd like to go to you. What are some of the biggest barriers that prevent engineering teams from experimenting and innovating? I know we pulled on that thread a little bit, but I want to hear your specific perspective.
So I think, one of the first things, and it has even nothing to do with coding or product or shipping. It's really a people concern, right? Without psychological safety, no one's ever going to try anything, right? So that I think is a foundation for even beyond engineering, for any company, any team to really, reach their potential. So there has to be psychological safety. There has to be the ability to understand that my opinions are valued, that my thoughts are valued, that I can speak up here and I'm not going to be judged, right? So you have to, the key thing that managers can do, any leader can do, is really build and reinforce that culture. But you can't just say there's psychological safety. You have to prove it. You have to show it and constantly reinforce it. I think one simple example of this, simple, straightforward example, but it's hard to really live out, is blameless postmortems, right? If there's a big failure, an actual failure, a system goes down, something breaks. Number one, making sure that it doesn't start with blame. It starts with, all right, let's figure out what happened. Let's get people together. Let's understand the problems, resolve the problem. And now let's go through here to figure out, what did we learn to prevent this from happening again? Not once ever mentioning it was Ariel that broke it, right? Once that happens, Ariel will never try anything again, because Ariel will always break things and never try it. So blameless postmortem is one of those examples that until you actually have one and people see it happening, no one's going to trust that there is psychological safety. You need real examples. So with that at the foundation, then yes, you can start having conversations about experimenting and innovating and trying things out, even though they might not work. And I think Jason said it perfectly. And I'll reframe it in some words that I got from one of our experimentation advisors at Split. Is like they used to say, you win some, you learn some, right? You don't win and you fail, you win and you learn. And even when you win, you learn. So I think it's a key piece here about, reframing failure from failing to, well, we learned something. We learned that doesn't work. Now, how do you reduce that risk even further? Well, learn as fast as you can, right? Learn that it failed as fast as you can to mitigate the impact. And there's other things about reinforcing that notion with engineers, that failing is okay, because you know what? And we have stats on this at Split, which is about 70% of everything you ship has either no impact or negative impact. Think about that. 70% of everything you ship. So start with that, and teams understanding, look, you didn't fail. You're doing what everybody else is doing, right? The question is, how do we get better at this? And the only thing I'll add to that is then say, great. So how do we get better at reducing that 70% of zero or no impact? Well, build smaller, ship smaller. If I spend a month and I ship something that has negative impact, that's a failure to me. We wasted a month. If I spend 2 days and test the same idea in the smallest way possible, and I learned in 2 days, then I've spent maybe a week on something and then move on to something else. So fail faster, fail sooner. Then that means you just learn sooner. You mitigated impact much sooner. That's the way I'd think about reframing failure. You learn instead of failing, and then fail smaller, fail sooner. Those kinds of things where you encourage that with the engineers. You're encouraging, pushing engineers to fail more often, because it means you're learning more often, and fail sooner because we're mitigating risks. We'll get them out of that habit of, I don't want to fail. They actually want to start failing because they want to start failing fast. They want to learn fast. The last thing I'll say on that is, learning pays dividends. And not only does it pay dividends, it is one of those things that it's like compounding interest. If I learn every single day and I keep building on that learning, it is unbelievable how in 2 weeks versus a month versus in 3 months, our decision making gets that much better. And we improve that probability of 70% being zero, no impact. We actually vastly decrease that because we're continually learning. That's the key piece there.
Absolutely. And a few of the things that you mentioned have been really guiding principles for Etsy, really. We've long held a belief in blameless postmortems, and we tout the value of them in terms of creating psychological safety and iterative, definitely small chunks. So a lot of what you said and what you said, Jason, resonate with me. I'd like to take a minute now and turn to you, Lisi. What role do you feel managers play in creating a culture of experimentation in their engineering teams?
So I love what has been said before, can only reinforce that. And I do believe that this is exactly where managers and their role comes into play, because what has been said, right, like reframing from failure to learning, because even if we can't validate our hypothesis, right, we still learn something. So it's not actually a failure. Same as what Ariel said about psychological safety. It's the foundation. If people are not feeling safe enough to even raise ideas what you could experiment with, or actually raising or pointing attention to the problems to tackle, where do we even start? So managers, I think, do really have a foundational role in creating that foundational culture, but I wouldn't stop there, actually. I think what managers can also do, because it is a quite specific position, is to also publicly experiment and lead by example, by action, not only by words and encouraging people, but, well, actions do speak louder than words usually. And also showcase their own failures in the sense of, hey, I tried this thing. I really thought it would be the best thing to do. Didn't work. So tapping into also sharing these kind of stories from experiments that didn't end up as you might have expected, but also from a management position. Of course, within safe constraints. So I'm not suggesting to experiment with people here in unethical ways. So yes, there should be some constraints here, but I really believe that you can also take that position of management or also leadership in general to foster that culture with your own actions, including including other pointers for people who also want to run experiments, like taking care of your own biases when it comes to experimentation, because that can also sometimes be a barrier that maybe you want to invest more and more because you just believe in the hypothesis, but you don't get any kind of confirming data. And it grows long and long, and we lose that fast learning that was just pointed out. So we basically lose the value from that. And maybe, opportunity cost, we should have switched paths. Or same with confirmation bias in general. If you're just looking for confirming data, you might not see what else is there and what we can learn from that. So to keep an open eye. Again, managers might help here everybody with pointing these kind of topics out, the tripwires, and leading by example also here. If they realize, hey, I just stepped into that trap myself, this is what I learned from that, I really feel that can help with the whole culture of fostering experimentation and encouraging people to follow those steps and also share. One caveat here, of course, it can't be okay if it's okay for managers to have experiments that don't work out, but actually their reports, they're treated differently. Yeah, that would also be quite loud actions and wouldn't really help fostering a culture of experimentation. So I do believe they are quite foundational here.
Absolutely. I think it's very key to dig into the role that managers specifically play. One thing I've seen managers do well in other companies is carving out time on a sprint or for a quarterly roadmap, whatever the case might be. And they might call that time 20% time. That's what we tend to refer to it as at Etsy, where people can go in and maybe try to refactor something in a new way, or they might be able to test or prototype something different. We've called it 20% time. We've called it tech investment time, but really carving out the space, I think, is a really strong example of creating that safety that you talked about, Ariel and Jason. So is there anyone, we have maybe time for one last thought on this question before we move on? Is there anything else anyone wants to add? And if not, that's okay. So why don't we move on to our next question? How can companies encourage risk-taking and experimentation without sacrificing quality or productivity? And Jason, I'd like to start with you.
Yeah, I mean, we could spend hours talking about this one. I think I have three thoughts here. I think the first one is just having the right safety nets in place to guard against mistakes or production issues. That's feature flags, it's observability. That's just, make it easy to kind of understand if there are changes in quality or changes in the experience, so that folks aren't, super afraid of making a change in your code. So that this is just general good, coding practice. And again, experiment is a change just like any other change. So if you're afraid of shipping code, then you need to solve that problem in your organization first. And I think, the second point is, in order to experiment or innovate or take risks, you need to know what the objective is, right? You can't just take a risk for the sake of taking a risk. You need to know what the objective is. So really, companies need to focus on the outcomes you want your team to drive, not just the work product or the output. So for instance, like instead of telling a team, hey, go build X thing, say to the team, hey, it's important that we drive this business metric or this user metric, go figure out how to solve that. And, our job as engineers isn't actually just to write code. That is not our job. Our job is to help our organizations ship impactful products. And it's really important to help engineers think about, how can I make my team or my organization more impactful, our products more useful. And again, that's important to set the kind of a mindset for outcomes, not just output. So this is a great precursor to them wanting to experiment, take risks, because they'll be invested in what your team's objective is, and then be able to be creative and ideate on that. I think lastly, you may want to try something really quickly. You may want to cut corners or do something, quote, hacky. Just try, but versus a big build out, right? Like, hey, this feature is going to take 3 months. Can we try it in a week to test it out? And I think, you use the word quality, which can always open up a lot of questions, because how do you define quality? So having guidelines in your organization for what passes the bar for MVP versus completed product is really important, because then that gives space for teams to operate within. I think everyone probably has heard of the Reid Hoffman quote, if you're not embarrassed by the first version of your product, you've launched too late. And that kind of applies here. And you're not shipping a full-fledged feature when you're doing an experiment, nor when you're just building the V1 of something new. You're going to continually improve it. So having kind of some guidelines, especially for Strava early on, of what was deemed like quality enough, where there's error rates or UX metrics or whatever, helps people know, okay, I don't need permission. This is hacky, but like good enough to go learn something. So those are my three thoughts there.
Absolutely. Very, very clear. Very, I definitely resonate. Those topics resonate with me a lot. I'm even stumbling over my words. But why don't we go to you, Lisi? I'd love to hear your take on this.
I really believe we're coming also back, that ties into the opening question to the panel as well, right? Are these standing in opposite directions? Is there dichotomy? I believe that if we don't do anything and we don't change anything, the quality will most likely degrade. So I would rather invest in also fast learning, small changes, see if we get into better directions. Also, when it comes to basically increase the quality, however we want to define it. And yes, we need to define, because quality is so contextual, not only for us from a product point of view, but also from a user point of view. It could be a very different answer asking very different users of the same product what makes it a quality product or not. So experiments, in my point of view and my experience, really support quality in that matter because of the fast, valuable learning. It's basically also what testing is all about, a series of lots of little experimentations to gain valuable information so we can make better informed decisions also for a product. So for me, it's quite a cornerstone for hopefully ending up with quality. It's not a guarantee, But if we don't do anything, it's most likely not adding to quality.
Amazing. Thank you both. So we have a few minutes, so I'd like to head over to our Q&A. And I see one question in. This is a great time to add any other questions you may have, but I'll start off with Dan Sherman's question. How do your teams handle experiments that graduate to full-fledged features? Put another way, how to structure for long-term ownership versus keeping bandwidth for future experimentation? This is a question that I think should resonate with all of us. I'd like to start with you, Ariel, and then maybe Jason.
I'm working back and forth with Slack, trying to get back into the channel as I'm bouncing around. Sorry, can you just repeat that question one more time?
Sure.
I'm lost in Slack.
Dan, this is a Q&A in the Zoom, but Dan Sherman asks, how do your teams handle experiments that graduate to full-fledged features? Put another way, how to structure long-term ownership while also keeping bandwidth for future experimentation?
And that I'll take that one. The challenge is the following. Often teams find this pressure to onto the next thing, onto the next thing, onto the next thing. And that can be true whether it's experimenting or building full-fledged features without experiments. I honestly actually believe that we spend too little time on seeing things through and completing them. I would argue that you don't necessarily have to keep bandwidth for future experimentation. Solidify the thing you just shipped, right? Solidify that thing, roll it out to 100%, monitor, evaluate it. Because here's the interesting thing. Even after we experiment and after we say we're going to roll out the feature 100%, we still keep learning. And if you don't keep that bandwidth in your team to actually iterate and apply on that learning, you're going to move on to the next thing and start iterating on that. And then you're going to be stuck in a place where you get feedback from the first thing, but you don't have the bandwidth to go back and improve it. So unfortunately, what you end up is with a lot of half-built products or half-completed solutions. So that's my argument there. Finish the thing fully or to a degree that you're comfortable, then move on to the next thing. It'll pay bigger dividends than trying to add more and more and more, because that's the natural thing that we all fall back to.
Very insightful. Thank you. We might have time for one more question. So Jason, this one from Kimberly Lowe Williams. Given the current macroeconomic climate, are you or any of you finding it challenging to get this type of work done? How do you drive this work during hard times?
I love this question. This is such a good question. And I think it kind of comes back to what we're talking about right at the beginning, which is about measurement. If you go to your CFO or your CEO and you say, hey, look at the impact that our work has done because I've measured it. And we are driving X amount more in revenue or X amount more in retained users. They're going to love that. And experimentation, again, is a measurement tool. And so through all of the teams that report into me, we know their impact because everything we shipped was an A/B test. So we know how much more subscriptions are coming in. We know, does the team pay for themselves? All those kind of metrics. And we can make a really great narrative for, hey, our work is impactful, versus if you're not experimenting and you just launch a feature in a non-controlled environment, or you're not experimenting or trying something, it's a lot harder to tell a narrative through numbers as well. And I think, it can get, I think the kind of pushback maybe to my answer, Kimberly, would be maybe on like the risk-taking side. And I think that's where you solve this through a portfolio of bets. So I always say, like, you kind of have a lot of singles where you're just trying to bat singles, nothing crazy. If you just work on optimizing copy or button placement, you're going to get a few percentage more conversion, right? Nothing crazy. You're not going to, IPO tomorrow because of the change. But then you have a lot of those that you just kind of have a lot of confidence that if you run enough, you will see some improvement. And then you have one or two medium-sized bets and maybe one big bet for your quarter. You're like, hey, here's the big one. Like, we think this could be really great, or it could be disaster, but we don't know. So let's try it. And I think by doing that, you ensure that you have some, metric increases that you can report back and be really proud of, but you also have the chance of really hitting it out the park with that grand slam. And that can be exciting. And then over time, your team will get better and better about doing this. But I think it's a great question.
Agreed. I think it's a wonderful question. And I think your answer, and I think all of the answers from our panelists today have just been incredibly on point and representative of perhaps this macroeconomic climate that we're all navigating. So I know we're right up at time for our webinar. I want to thank all of the panelists for joining us. I want to just thank you all. I love the opportunity to moderate. I think we learned a few key things today. We heard your insights and your experiences. You talked about the importance of creating psychological safety. You talked about reframing failure as a learning, and many of you doubled down on like measurement being key. And I always, in my experience, there's so many things that we can measure. We can measure tons of things in Grafana, but I've always found it helpful to map those measurements back to some key business KPI to help in terms of certain uncertainties in the tech environment. So I really want to just reinforce everything that was shared today. And I want to thank you all. So we will now head over to the hashtag building software channel in Slack to take any additional questions from all of you. Thank you so much.